When last we left off, Scipio Africanus stood on the precipice of total victory. He had fully conquered Spain, and had routed the main Carthaginian army in Africa. In fact, his victory was so close that Carthage had very nearly signed a peace treaty. However, Scipio still had one more test to face, and that was Hannibal Barca. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask that you subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out and it motivates me to make more content. Also, if you have any comments on the video or suggestions, then please leave them down below. I also want to thank ZK and M. Luca in particular for commenting and subscribing. It really helps me out so much, and it really motivates me to make more content. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. Hannibal Barca was likely the only person alive at the time that could match Scipio on either the battlefield or in accomplishments. Hannibal had sparked the war by attacking a Roman ally in Spain. He had marched through the Alps with an army of war elephants to attack the Romans from the north. He had dealt Rome its worst defeat in its history at Cannae, a defeat so incredibly horrible that it would serve as the benchmark for determining the severity of defeats until the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest nearly 200 years later. He had essentially occupied southern Italy for the better part of 15 years. He was Carthage's last and only hope. Hannibal's arrival back in Africa bolstered the failing morale and motivation of Carthage. This newly bolstered morale led to the government back in Carthage calling for Hannibal to quickly give battle to Scipio. However, Hannibal himself was much more cautious. While the core of his army was filled with his own veterans and mercenaries from Italy, the rest of the army was made up of newly raised levies from all across Africa. These men were not the cream of the crop. We must remember that Scipio had just destroyed the main Carthaginian army at Utica, and before that had destroyed the army in Spain. These men were not just the backups, they were the backups of the backups. It shouldn't be surprising then that Hannibal was hesitant to march straight into battle. The two armies would eventually meet at a flat plain just south of modern-day Al-Kif. We don't have any sources who definitively state how many men Scipio had under his command. We know that he landed in Africa with somewhere between 25 and 30,000 men. However, we have no records of any reinforcements arriving from Italy, and we have no idea how many men were lost to simple attrition or the few battles and skirmishes the army had fought in so far. The ancient sources, Polybius mostly, state that Rome was backed by some 6,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry under Massinissa, the newly crowned Numidian king. The historian Appian, who would write about the events some 300 years later, wrote that Rome had 34,500 troops at the battle. Most modern historians reject this number, and instead believe that the Romans commanded somewhere between 29 and 30,000 troops. Personally, I would assume the Romans commanded roughly 30,000 troops. Scipio had done an excellent job, sometimes through fairly dubious means, in ensuring that the main Roman army lost as few troops as possible. The two main battles, the Battle at Utica and the Battle of the Great Plains, both resulted in the Carthaginians breaking very quickly. This likely meant that Rome did not lose too many men. This, along with the fact that Massinissa now had full access to the full manpower of Numidia, should mean that Scipio was able to replace much of his losses. However, the key here is that Rome was still outnumbered. On the other side of the battlefield, the Carthaginians under Hannibal likely commanded 40,000 men. This comes from Polybius, so it could have certainly been less. However, it is likely that the Romans were significantly outnumbered. Hannibal likely only had 4,000 cavalry, as his men had been forced to abandon their horses in southern Italy due to a lack of shipping space. Hannibal also had some 80 war elephants. This would actually be the first time that Scipio would face war elephants. We don't really know why, but there is no record of any other Carthaginian army deploying elephants against Rome, save for the army of Hannibal. This was also the first battle for Scipio, where he would have the cavalry advantage, but the infantry disadvantage. Hannibal deployed his army in 4 groups. In the front were his elephants. Behind them were a continuous line of mercenaries, then a line of his allies, and then finally, bringing up the rear, were his veterans. Hannibal's cavalry formed the wings of the army. Scipio had done something similar, but Scipio had not created a single continuous line. Instead, he had deployed his troops in columns with empty space in between. This space was filled with lightly armored infantry, so that Hannibal did not expect anything, but those troops were very mobile and ready to retreat at a moment's notice. Hannibal made the first move and sent his elephants charging. Normally, an elephant charge was deadly and absolutely terrifying for the enemy army. However, Scipio had done his research, and had thought of a rather ingenious way to counter the elephants. The first defense was the columns mentioned earlier. As soon as the elephants began their charge, Scipio ordered the columns clear. This provided a lane for the elephants to run through without causing any damage. The second defense was a simultaneous cacophony of sound from the Roman trumpets and drummers. This sudden noise disorientated and frightened many of the elephants, and actually sent a few back towards the Carthaginian lines. Hannibal's charge had completely and utterly failed. In response, Scipio sent both his Roman and Numidian cavalry to attack Hannibal's own. The two forces met behind the main Carthaginian lines. At the same time, Scipio ordered his infantry to advance. Both battles turned in favor of the Romans fairly quickly. On the infantry front, the Romans pushed the Carthaginian mercenaries back into the line of Carthaginian allies. The lines were so tightly packed that the Carthaginian allies couldn't retreat any further, as the lines of normal Carthaginian infantry were not moving. The mercenaries were now being slowly crushed between the slowly advancing Roman lines and the static Carthaginian lines. The situation became so dire that the mercenaries began to attack the Carthaginian allies in a desperate bid to escape. While all of this was happening, the Roman cavalry had managed to rout the Carthaginian cavalry, and were now free to charge the back of the Carthaginian army. The Carthaginians were quickly surrounded and destroyed. Some 20,000 Carthaginians were killed, and the same amount were taken prisoners. The Romans lost only 1,500 men according to Polybius. This number was likely much higher, probably somewhere around 5,000, but in any case, the Romans had definitively won the day. Hannibal himself knew the war was lost, and thus entered into negotiations with Scipio. Scipio would pardon Hannibal, and Hannibal would return to Rome and urge the Carthaginian Senate to accept peace, as Carthage was simply spent. They could not possibly muster any force strong enough to defeat Scipio, and thus a peace treaty was written and sent to Rome for approval. The treaty stripped Carthage of all of its overseas territories, instructed Carthage to pay 10,000 silver talents to Rome, gave Carthage several political prisoners, and forbid Carthage from having any war elephants. It also reduced the Carthaginian war fleet to 10 ships and forbade Carthage from waging war outside of Africa, and only allowed Carthage to wage war in Africa with the express permission from the Roman Senate. This essentially made Carthage politically subordinate to Rome, and would ensure that Carthage could never threaten Rome in any serious capacity again. Hannibal was forced into exile to avoid being handed over to Rome, and would drift from foreign court to foreign court, selling his military expertise in exchange for protection. Eventually, however, Rome would catch up to him, and Hannibal would commit suicide to avoid capture at the hands of the Romans. Scipio would return to Rome as a legend. He was the bane of Carthage and Hannibal, and he had conquered Spain and Africa. It is unsurprising, then, that even with the Senate being biased against him, Scipio was granted a triumph. It was during this triumph that he would be awarded his famous agnomen, the Roman equivalent of a nickname, Africanus, meaning the African. Scipio was beloved by the populace of Rome, even later being turned into a son of Jupiter himself. And remember that Scipio was only in his early 30s. He had accomplished more than most Romans, plebeian or patrician, would in their entire lives. It shouldn't be surprising, then, that Scipio was viewed with much jealousy by the Roman aristocracy. Scipio would be elected censor in 199 BCE. His time in office would be largely unremarkable. The only real thing of note was Scipio was made Princeps Senatus sometime during his censorship. After the required 10 years had passed, Scipio was elected to his second consulship in 194 BCE. During this consulship, Scipio largely allowed his fellow consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, to take the leading role. In 190 BCE, Scipio would follow his brother, Lucius Cornelius Scipio, into war in Greece. Antiochus III, the ruler of the Seleucid Empire, had invaded Greece, which at the time was under the political hegemony of Rome. Lucius was the consul, and appointed his brother to serve as one of his legates. By the time the two Scipios had arrived in Greece, Antiochus was on the back foot, and looked to offer peace. However, both the Scipios and the Roman Senate wanted more from the king, and thus pushed the war even further. Eventually, the two would sign a treaty that ceded all of Greece and most of Anatolia to Rome, along with 20 hostages and war reparations. Upon their return to Rome, the two brothers instantly faced jealous persecutions. Lucius was put on trial and fined for improperly using the funds he secured from the war with Antiochus. He refused to pay this fine, and was only saved from prison by the intervention of the tribune of the plebs. Scipio himself was also charged with misusing funds. However, that attempt did not go so well for the Senate. Scipio brought forward the books that showed the money spent and proceeded to rip them up right in front of the Senate. It is very likely that in the end the Senate realized that attempting to charge or put Scipio in prison would backfire among the general public, and thus stuck to picking on the less famous and less impressive brother. Scipio would die a legend somewhere between 183 and 185 BCE. He influenced everything from military tactics to fashion trends, as he was the man to introduce the clean-shaven look that would dominate the Roman political elite for the next 3 centuries, until the Emperor Hadrian. He had never lost a battle, and was the first Roman general to conquer land outside of Italy for Rome. Scipio is the type of legend that Rome would not see again until the time of Caesar, and he is without a doubt one of, if not the, greatest Romans to have ever lived. So that is it. This was the first person in the Roman series. I'm not too sure who will be next, but we will find out tomorrow. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. If you have any comments on the video or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.